My name is John Wilmshurst. I am the Native Grassland Conservation Manager for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I also want to introduce you to Catherine Peel, who is the project coordinator for our Grasslands Awareness Program, and she's going to be helping today with the Q&A, and she's just an essential part of the program. I want to welcome everyone from across the country to the third in our 7 webinar series that we're presenting over the next couple of months, where we are highlighting grassland conservation across Canada. We're calling this series Canada's Native Grasslands, our most endangered ecosystem. Before I get going, I want to have a few housekeeping notes. I want to share my screen to do that. It takes a second for that to load up. Okay, you should see that now. This is the typical Zoom webinar controls. We've done this if you've seen our webinars in the past. These are the typical controls that you'll see if you're having trouble or if I'm too loud or if too soft. You can adjust your audio settings here in the bottom control bar. We will have a presentation today about 45 minutes. This will give us time at the end for questions and answers. We would ask you, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A section again at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see this box at the bottom of your screen, there might be a little 3 dots and a more button. Click on that and it shows up in that menu. That's what happens on my screen. And of course, the chat is open and we invite people to participate in the chat. You can introduce yourself and have a conversation there about what the presentation is today. The meeting today is being recorded, and so you will get a link to that recording as a follow-up to your registration for this webinar today. Oh. Yeah, and Canadian Wildlife Federation, we do quite a number of webinars, and as part of our series, we really do, we've established some engagement guidelines, and I really do want to emphasize these things. They're basically common sense. I mean, the point of these webinars is to engage, so to inquire and to share knowledge, and we're really excited about today's presentation to participate in that process. And also, it's really important, and we ask our speakers and we ask you in the questions and answers and in the chat to create a common understanding, clarify any technical terms you may be using, and certainly acronyms. And then the rest are just sort of shared values: empathy, curiosity, respect. These are things that we experience with our audiences, and we thank you for adhering to these. And shared airtime, we will have 15 minutes at the end for Ian to answer your questions. And so if you ask more than one question, we get quite a few questions. Ian may not have time to answer them all at the end. And so if you ask a whole bunch, we may not be able to get to them. So please, I hope there's some understanding there. Okay, the Canadian Wildlife Federation is really proud to host this series, but it is the work of a really amazing collaboration of the Canadian Grasslands Coalition through a grant from Environment and Climate Change Canada that has allowed this series to happen. Our work to bring awareness to native grasslands in Canada can also be found at www.canadasgrasslands.ca, and there's a QR code at the bottom of the screen that you see that would take you to that webpage. And the coalition members are shown up, their logos are shown up also on that screen. Members of the Canadian Grassland Coalition live and work across Canada, and we wish to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples who have called this land home since time immemorial. We are committed to working together in the spirit of collaboration, reconciliation, and change, honoring all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. The Grasslands Coalition is all about introducing Canadians to grasslands, what they are, where they are, why they're important, what threatens them, and how we can all help conserve them. I don't know if you're aware, but this is the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, declared by the United Nations, and we're celebrating that this year with an awareness campaign that we just completed and this webinar series that we hope brings a little bit of awareness to what grasslands are all about. And we hope this series does help introduce some of you to the amazing places that Canada's grasslands are. Okay, so on to our speaker. Today we have Ian Cook joining us with the webinar entitled Applying the Bird-friendliness Index to Address Systemic Drivers of Grassland Bird Declines. It's a mouthful. But Ian is a really great speaker, and he will clarify what all that means. And just, for context, the work that Birds Canada and Ian have been doing for the last number of years with the Bird Friendliness Index, I really see as an essential component of conservation because what it does and you'll hear about this is it ensures that landowners and managers who are really the greatest conservationists in the grassland space, that they get rewarded for that in some way. There's a possibility for them to conserve the native biodiversity on their farms and ranches and see some benefits from that. That helps them, their operations, and their families. And so this is a really essential piece of the conservation puzzle that is in the grassland space in Canada. As the Grassland Conservation Manager for Birds Canada, Ian's work largely focuses on finding solutions to conserving birds that rely on grasslands. Along with his colleagues at Birds Canada, Ian works on finding systemic solutions to conserve birds while sustaining the livelihoods of the people on the land. Ian got his BSc in agriculture from the University of Manitoba in 2013 and is a professional agrologist. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, and I forgot to go to, I forgot to change my, that's the title slide for Ian's talk. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Ian.
Great. Well, thank you, John. You're going to see enough of me over the next 45 minutes. You didn't need to have this title slide. So I'm just going to do a little bit of organizing so that I can see my notes and so on, and then yeah. So, well, thank you very much, everyone, for having me and for tuning in, and thank you to CWF and the Grasslands Coalition for having me and being able to share some of our work. So, first, before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that I live on Treaty 2 land here in Western Manitoba, and this is the traditional territories of Métis people, Cree, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people. And we at Birds Canada understand that Indigenous voices, their knowledge, and their ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. So we really gratefully support the needs and aspirations and the rights of Indigenous people to care for the land and the birds that rely on the land. So just a quick, if you're not familiar with Birds Canada, we're a national charitable organization that's dedicated to bird conservation. Our vision is that all bird species in Canada are thriving in healthy and diverse habitats. And we have, every day we do work that is focused on bird conservation. We have thousands of caring donors. I mean, some of you might be donors. We have over 100 passionate staff across the country. We also have more than 74,000 volunteers that participate in citizen science programs and that are taking action to help save wild birds and their habitats. And we like to say that together we are Canada's voice for birds. So, as John mentioned, this webinar series, which I think is really great, and it's focused on sort of spreading the good word about how truly special grasslands are. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about sharing my perspective on how special grasslands are. So I'm going to talk a lot about the Canadian prairies. And here in the spring and summer, we have these grasslands and the pastures that are teeming and fluttering with grassland specialists. Many of them are unique to and totally reliant on North America's grasslands. We also have waterfowl and shorebirds that use the prairie pothole wetlands as havens to raise their young or as places to rest and refuel before they continue on their journey further north, often all the way to the Arctic. We also have aerial insectivores or swallows and kingbirds that are plucking flying insects right out of the sky above wetlands and streams. And of course, we have hawks and eagles that are using the sporadic trees here on this landscape to scan for their next meal. So an incredibly diverse and special place for birds, but it's also, a really important place and really, I'd like to say, sort of a world of weird and wonderful wildlife. We have mammals that are we have mammals like the swift fox, which is this house cat-sized fox, and it's Canada's smallest canine species. We have reptiles that are like the prairie rattlesnake. That's a pit viper. It senses its prey through heat sensors between its eyes. And then, of course, one of my personal favorites, the burrowing owls. This owl that lives underground in burrows dug by badgers, which badgers are one of their main predators. So I think that we have such a unique and special and sort of weird set of species that rely on this landscape, and they all possess those exact characteristics that are needed to thrive in this landscape that's defined by temperature extremes and has been shaped over millennia by grazing and frequent fire. So it's a really wonderful place. And so I work for a bird conservation organization, and I think that this is such a special place for birds. And this is a screenshot from something called the Migration Explorer. And if you have a chance to play around with this is very cool, because this is a map generated from data from tracking devices that have been placed on birds. So all the different colored lines that you're seeing on this map are flight paths of individual birds that they've made as they migrate back and forth from their wintering grounds to the breeding grounds. So this is generated using data, some of the data from Birds Canada's work with the MODIS wildlife tracking system. But we can see that we've got shorebirds that are in the yellow lines, and water birds that are in the purple, and waterfowl in the blue lines, using the Canadian prairies. So many of them will, again, use this as stopover habitat to rest and refuel, or many of them will also nest here and raise their young here and use those wetlands to raise their young. We also have land birds. Some are continuing further north into the boreal forest. And of course, the grassland birds that are coming to the grasslands of the Canadian prairies and the northern Great Plains. So it's thought that the prairie ecosystem, because of this combination of that it's such important stopover habitat and nesting habitat, that it's thought to be important to more bird species than almost any other ecosystem in North America. And some, like the bobolink, that's a grassland bird, it undertakes massive migration every year, making a 12,500-mile round trip journey each year, going from, so this is a bird that uses the grasslands right across Canada, from central BC across the prairies into eastern Canada, and then in the wintertime it flies down to southern Brazil and northern Argentina. But why I wanted to talk a little bit about, why do birds bother doing this? Why fly all that way? Why don't they just stay in a nice tropical location where it's warm all year round? Well, the short answer is food. And that comes spring and summer in the northern latitudes and in grasslands here on the Canadian prairies, it explodes with an abundance of insects. So it's a little bit tough to see, but if you can see these brown streaks in this photograph, these are clouds of midges that, if you spent some time on the prairies, it's a fairly common sight here on the Canadian prairies. And it's these insects that have these birds making these migrations, because they're such a critical food source for birds, especially when they're raising their young. In the egg laying and in the juvenile stages of life, the proteins and the fats and the amino acids that are in insects are such an important resource, and is the main reason why these birds undergo long and often dangerous migrations. So we have birds that might even be seed eaters when they're on the wintering grounds, but when they're here on the Canadian prairies in the summer, they focus on insects. And so a tremendous amount of birds rely on the grassland habitats of the Canadian prairies, because for many of them, this is the best place on the planet for them to raise their young, and they will take tremendous risks and pay a tremendous cost to get here often. Unfortunately, birds that rely on the agricultural working landscape and the grasslands of the Canadian prairies are in steep decline. So we can see some of those groups of birds that I just talked about. We have shorebirds, aerial insectivores, and long-distant migrants. These are all birds that often rely on the Canadian prairies. that are seeing sharp declines. And then, of course, grassland birds that have seen the largest decline of any bird group in Canada since 1970. They've lost a full two-thirds of their population since 1970. And if we dig into this grassland bird group a little bit more, we can see that it's made up of kind of generally two groups. We have birds that can make a living more in those agricultural landscapes, use small remnant habitat, grassland habitats. And then we have birds that are really reliant on native grasslands. They're native grassland specialists. And you can see that these native grassland specialists that really rely on those grasslands that have never been tilled up, they have declined by 90% since 1970. And to be, a bit bleak, I suppose, but if we don't act quickly and more effectively for some of the birds that are part of that native grassland specialist group, by the time that my 4-year-old daughter is my age, it's possible that she will not be able to find some of these native grassland specialists on the Canadian prairies anymore. And the primary cause of this habitat loss is really the primary cause of this, is habitat loss, largely due to the ongoing loss of grasslands. And that loss of grasslands is mostly from the conversion of grassland habitats and the wetlands and the riparian areas that are embedded within those grassland habitats. It's the conversion of those to cropland is the primary cause of this habitat loss, and thus the declines that we're seeing in grassland birds and other birds that rely on the agricultural landscape. So, for example, when a Sprague's pipit, like we see here, this is a really neat bird that is one of those native grassland specialists, and they sing really high above the prairie, and they have this neat descending song that you can seem to hear from miles around. And when they're doing that, what they're doing is they're staking out a territory to breed and to raise their young. So they're attracting mates and they're staking out a territory that's at least a hectare in size. So that's what they need to raise their young. So each year, when we're losing thousands of hectares of grasslands, we're also losing thousands of potential homes for grassland birds, like the Sprague's pipit. On the prairies, though, one of the best mechanisms to keep grasslands intact is having them as economically viable working landscapes. So what I mean by that is when farmers and ranchers are able to generate a livelihood from grazing livestock like cows on these grasslands, it's actually a really important mechanism to keep these grasslands intact. And when grazing animals like cattle are managed well, they actually help to provide the conditions that these grassland birds need, because grassland birds evolved with large grazers on the landscape, bison, before bison were forcibly removed from the landscape. However, the tilling up of grasslands and the conversion of grasslands to croplands is largely driven by that it often just makes more financial sense for producers to till up grasslands and try to grow crops than it does to keep those grasslands intact and try to raise cows. So this is not to say that crop farming is bad or that it's easy. It's not. It's necessary, and it's a difficult way to make a living. But it is recognizing that generally the economics of crop farming tend to pencil out better than grazing livestock. And some of this is due to that, despite the urgent need that we have to address bird and biodiversity loss, our agri-food system just generally doesn't value biodiversity. Farmers and ranchers are paid for the commodities they produce, how many tons of wheat or canola they grow, how many pounds of beef they produce. So when they don't have a direct economic benefit for conserving birds and biodiversity, it makes it just really difficult for agricultural producers to incorporate biodiversity into their management decisions. And ultimately, this encourages practices that are causing the loss of birds on the landscape, such as plowing up grasslands to grow annual crops. So our work on the Canadian Prairies for Birds Canada is really focused on addressing these systemic economic issues that are at the root cause of grassland bird population declines. And we're working collaboratively with a number of conservation organizations and producers and stakeholders to collaboratively try to build an ag system that does incorporate bird conservation, does incorporate biodiversity, and a system that actively recovers nature while also sustaining the livelihoods for the people on the land. And one of the avenues that we think will help achieve this is enabling this direct economic benefit to producers for providing benefits to bird and biodiversity conservation. And in that way, making these grass-based and biodiverse production systems like cattle production more financially viable. So we about 5 years ago got thinking about, well, how could we do this? How could we play a role and complement some of the great work that's already going on in the grassland conservation landscape? And so we know that generally these farms, we've established these farms and ranches that are keeping grasslands intact are providing a lot of benefit for grassland bird conservation and other bird conservation. So we started exploring, well, if we could effectively measure and communicate the value that these farms are having to bird conservation, and we did that in a really easy to understand, but also a rigorous way, could we start to make some progress towards communicating how important these places are and driving revenue to those places? We also know that birds are generally good ecological indicators. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then we also know our own strengths. We know that we're really, as Birds Canada, we're good at bird monitoring. We're good at leveraging bird science to drive conservation for birds. So how can we do this? And we found something called the Bird-friendliness Index. So this is an indicator that was originally developed by the National Audubon Society. And what this does is it can measure impacts to bird conservation at a farm level and then communicate those impacts to multiple different stakeholders within the agricultural economic system. So from the producers themselves to different stakeholders such as agri-food companies, to banks, and ultimately to consumers. So our strategy is really focused on addressing the systemic economic issues by focusing around the implementation of the Bird Friendliness Index and applying this in different innovative tools like risk management tools and market and financial tools that would increase the economic viability of these places that are providing good outcomes for birds. So since 2021, we've been kept really busy at adapting this to the Canadian prairies and to the end use of using it in these market-based tools to reward producers for bird conservation outcomes. So in a nutshell, I'm going to go sort of broad strokes over how the Bird Friendliness Index works, but in a nutshell, it consists of two inputs, or it considers two inputs. First, how many birds are on a farm or ranch, so how many birds per hectare, and then the conservation status of the birds that are there. So common birds count towards the bird conservation or the Bird Friendliness Index, but birds that are at higher risk, like species at risk, are weighted more highly. So how many birds are on a place, and then the conservation status of those birds. And then we compare those two components of the bird community on a farm or a ranch, and we compare it to the bird community that's in the surrounding landscape around that farm. And this comparison between the farm and the surrounding landscape generates a score between 0 and 1, where 0.5 represents that landscape average. So a farm scoring above 0.5 on the Bird Friendliness Index means that that farm is providing above average benefits to birds in their region because there are more birds and more birds that need a lot of help on that farm compared to the surrounding landscape. So we think in this there are a number of different components that make it well suited for what we want to achieve that I'm going to go through in a little bit. But ultimately, we think that this is something that's scientifically rigorous, but also it gives us a good way to easily communicate the benefit that an individual farmer or rancher is providing to bird conservation. So we've been working on this since 2021 and adapting it. And in 2025, we took a really exciting step towards applying the bird friendliness index in the way that we want by running a pilot. A pilot was funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we partnered with the Saskatchewan Stockgrowers Foundation to apply the bird friendliness index in a mechanism to pay producers for bird outcomes. So the way that this worked was that producers and a couple of community pastures signed 15-year habitat management agreements or restoration agreements with the Saskatchewan Stockgrowers Foundation. So this made those producers and pastures then eligible to enroll in the Bird Friendliness Index incentive payment pilot. And they would then receive a per acre payment if they scored above 0.5 on the Bird Friendliness Index. So producers and pastures signed an agreement with the Saskatchewan Stockgrowers Foundation. We went out and conducted bird surveys that were representative of those of the farms and ranches that were participating. So we sent people out to do point counts, to deploy autonomous recording units to measure how many birds were there. And then we calculated a bird friendliness index score. And if they scored above 0.5, then they were eligible for a per acre payment. So we had 14 producer participants, and we had 2 community pastures representing around 200,000 acres in southwestern Saskatchewan. And so we're just wrapping up sort of our first year and going into our second year of this pilot. So there will be lots more to share about this after the second year, but it's already been really valuable to inform how we apply the bird friendliness index at a broader scale, and so that it is effective at achieving what we want to achieve by embedding bird conservation in the agricultural system. And we're collecting feedback from producers on how they like the concept, what could be done better. We're also learning, what level of compensation is meaningful to producers, and we've already made some changes to how we go about things off the back of this pilot. So it's been really, really useful, and some general results from this. So we had 16 sites in total. We had 13 out of the 16 sites that we are 16 farms and ranches and pastures that scored above 0.5 and thus were eligible and received a payment in 2025. So just to kind of put into context about what does a bird friendliness index score actually mean in terms of the contribution that's being made to bird conservation. So if we look at those farms and ranches that scored in the highest, sort of towards the highest that you can score on the bird friendliness index. So if we look at the ranches that scored between 0.8 and 1, which was the majority of the producers that participated, actually, they scored towards this higher end. That we found on these places that they had on average 10% more common birds on those farms and ranches than in the surrounding landscape. So they had 10% more species, or 10% more birds like western meadowlarks, savanna sparrows, those sorts of birds. So pretty good. But then when we looked at those native grassland specialists, those birds that are in highest need of conservation and are declining the fastest, we found that these places were incredibly important for these species at risk. So like the chestnut-collared longspur, like Sprague's pipit, Baird sparrows, these birds that were reliant on native grasslands. And on these places that were participating in the pilot and scoring quite highly on the bird friendliness index, we found around 6 times the densities of species at risk compared to the surrounding landscape. So there's a tremendous amount of value to bird conservation that's being provided by some of these places that are scoring high on the bird friendliness index. So we've learned a lot from the pilot, and I'm going to take just a kind of a moment to talk a little bit about why we think the bird friendliness index is a good way to encourage bird conservation on the agricultural working landscape. And any effective indicator needs to balance a number of different factors that are often kind of in tension with one another. You know, you need to be scientifically rigorous. We need it to scale to affect the scale of change that we need it to. We also needed to be attractive to the various different people that we need to encourage to do good things for birds. So that's it needs to be attractive to the producers themselves. It also needs to be attractive to these agri-food stakeholders, and ultimately needs to be attractive to consumers so that we can affect the positive change. Um, so we think that while not a panacea for all the problems, the BFI is pretty well suited to achieving the sorts of things that we want to achieve. And I wanted to walk through this because I think it's a bit useful to walk through some of these things to help illustrate all of the different things that we as a grassland conservation community and grassland conservationists have to work to balance and consider as we work to conserve these landscapes and the wildlife that rely on it. So you've heard some really great webinars already. You're going to hear more later on. And these are all similar things that everybody's trying to balance in this working landscape. So we need to balance scientific rigor, scalability, and the human dimensions so that we can achieve what we want to achieve for grassland birds. So first we have to consider scientific rigor. And how do we apply this at the scale that we need to, because the scale of the problem is huge and the landscape is huge. So we also have to think about the human dimensions, the social side of things. People are trying to make a living on this landscape. How do we motivate people across the food system towards positive change? And we think that using birds as indicators helps to address scientific rigor and the human dimensions and social science side of things. And from that side, the human dimensions, you know, birds are pretty amazing, and they have a lot of resonance, and that's because they're pretty fascinating. I'm a little bit biased. I work for a bird conservation organization, but I'm also looking out the window at the 3 to 4 inches of snow that we got last night, and I'm desperate to hear bird song come the spring. And because when we do see birds and hear birds, it's a moment of joy and wonder, really. And birds are that sort of really easy connection to nature that a lot of us have. And that's true for someone that's living in Winnipeg or Toronto, as it is for someone that's ranching in Manitoba or Saskatchewan. Birds just have a tremendous ability to bring, you know, people to common ground, and they have a lot of resonance with producers and consumers alike. And everybody can really kind of get behind the message or the idea that more birds on a farm need our help, or more birds that need our help on a farm equals a good thing. And from the stakeholder side of things, something that we really try to communicate is that there are a lot of us that care a lot about birds. There are 10 million Canadians every single year that spend our hard-earned money on feeding birds and building houses for them. And bird watching is actually more popular than golfing. So we think that using birds as indicators can help us really tap into that human dimensions and social science side of things. So birds are amazing. That's why we're using birds as indicators. But there are also good environmental indicators. So getting more of that scientific rigor side of things. And they make good environmental indicators for a few different reasons. Is that first, if we recall that map of all the different migration paths of birds, is that we find birds everywhere. They use all sorts of habitats. They use the grasslands, they use the aspen bluffs, they use the wetlands, they use the rivers. So they are using varied habitats and lots of different places within the landscape. So because of that, they tend to tell us a lot about the overall ecological health of a landscape. Excuse me. They're also really well studied. So we know a lot about birds. Remember the map of the migrations, right? Those are all individual birds that we've tracked where they're going in some way, shape, or form. Remember that we have, 74,000 volunteers that are actively contributing data to help us inform science and conservation. So we know a lot about birds. And then the other thing is that they're mobile and responsive to change. So they have wings. And when things are not what they, for most birds, when something good or something bad happens to their habitat, they respond really quickly. So if habitat is restored, birds, when they come back from their wintering grounds, they key in on that habitat and they use it again. Same thing if that habitat disappears. They don't see it as habitat and they move on. So birds are amazing. They're well studied, and part of the reason why they're well studied is that they're relatively easy to study. So what makes them relatively easy to study and to survey and thus make them fairly well suited for using them as indicators? Well, for one thing, birds sing to communicate. So they do that for various reasons. They advertise for potential mates. They advertise their fitness. They say, hey, I'm singing more than anybody else. I'm the fittest guy out here. And then they also sing to establish and defend territories. So at the right time of year, then, all we need to do is listen. And if we know what we're listening for, they're essentially yelling out their names. And there aren't a whole lot of things in the world that you can count without ever laying eyes on them, which we can do for many species of birds. So birds, with their resonance, their responsiveness to change in the landscape, and the fact that they're relatively cost effective and easy to monitor, makes them generally good environmental indicators. Oops. Sorry, gang. Sorry. I thought my slides were out of order. Um, so that's sort of the bird side of things and the scientific rigor and the social science side of why we're using birds as indicators. The other side of this bird friendliness index is that this is looking at an outcomes based approach to conservation. And what we mean by that is that we're measuring birds and then we're looking to reward people based on the outcomes that they're providing for birds. We're looking at the densities and the conservation value of the birds, and we're not as concerned about how they got to those outcomes, but instead rewarding ultimately that you're providing a lot of benefit to bird conservation because we've measured birds and we know that. So this outcomes based approach can be complementary to all the different programming that already exists out there because it's a non-prescriptive approach. And when we talk to producers, they indicate to us that this sort of outcomes based or this non-prescriptive approach to conservation is something that they felt has been missing from the conservation landscape. And what this does is that it gives producers a lot of control and a lot of agency on how they can achieve the conservation goals. And it aligns conservation with the way that they think about the rest of their operation. So they can set goals for themselves for what they want to achieve for bird conservation and their bird friendliness index score. They can adapt based on those outcomes. How can they change their management to achieve both what they want to do for their production goals, but also for what they want to do for their bird conservation goals? And then they can choose who they want to work with, what actions they want to take that best fit within their operation. And one of the things with this outcomes based approach is that it's using the birds themselves as the outcome. And this, again, with the resonance of birds, makes it a really great place to engage with producers. It gives them, it gives us something that we can talk about. And it also has the potential to have them become very knowledgeable on bird biology and conservation because we're talking about the actual outcomes for birds. And in some of the one-on-one engagement we've been doing with the participants in the pilot, we find that these producers often are showing a really solid understanding of the bird community on their landscape, but also of how their bird community is contributing to their bird friendliness index score. And they're picking up on the bird outcomes that are influencing their scores, like high densities of species at risk, like chestnut calla longspurs. And they're making the connections between the presence of those birds and the habitat conditions that those birds must like. And something that I found really interesting is that I email their reports before I sit down across their kitchen table. And when I show up to their kitchen table, they often have a lot of questions for me already ready to go, which I find really exciting. It's because it shows that they're proactively taking the time to evaluate their results and understand what's driving their bird friendliness index score, and thinking about, okay, what management that I'm currently doing or management that I could do that could improve my bird friendliness index score or is contributing to my bird friendliness index score already. So this outcomes based approach and giving producers a lot of agency over how they achieve their conservation goals is quite exciting, and can, I think, can work really well in complement with some of the existing conservation programming that's out there, like the habitat management agreements that Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation are doing, or like the different programs that Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing, Ducks Unlimited, Manitoba Habitat Conservancy. We think that this approach can just increase the uptake of the programming and increase the efficiency or the effectiveness of those programs, because now producers have a direct economic benefit for providing positive outcomes for birds, and they're going to seek out these programs to participate in to continue to improve things for birds. My voice is starting to go. I apologize. Um, and we think that this just presents then a really big win-win for all sorts of producers in society at large. So I'm talking about all the different programs that are out there, and there are a lot of really good programs out there, and that if you are a producer that's interested in some of these various programs that a lot of great organizations are putting out there, there are some resources. And I put these up here because, A, if you want to participate in some of them, but also to illustrate that there are a lot of good programs out there that we think that this bird friendliness index and an outcomes based approach can help to complement. So, to begin sort of wrapping up a little bit here, I hope that helped to illustrate a little bit that conservation in working landscapes requires balancing a lot of different priorities and consider a lot of different factors. And of course, the Canadian prairies and the grasslands across Canada, this is especially true. And we think that this outcomes based approach to conservation using the bird friendliness index, it's going to enable agri-food stakeholders to more easily participate, measure their impact, and then give them a lot of confidence to reward producers for their positive contributions to bird conservation. And that this is not a silver bullet, but it can be an important piece of the puzzle so that we can start to shift the balance towards an ag system that actively conserves birds while also sustaining the people, the livelihoods of the people on the landscape. And by working together across these different lines in the agricultural sector, in the conservation sector, we can create a working landscape that's teeming with life and saves some of these grassland birds that rely on these landscapes. And I'm going to end on sort of a note that, because we know that this is possible. This is from the State of Canada's Birds Report that Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada puts out. And we can see that these graphs, we've got raptors, and we've got wetland and waterfowl, wetland birds and waterfowl, sorry, that have increased since 1970 in their population. So this is evidence that when we take deliberate and effective action, we can do tremendous things for bird conservation. You know, we collectively realized in the agriculture community and the conservation community that bird of prey declines could be largely attributed to the use of a chemical called DDT. And the discontinuation of using that chemical has contributed to bird of prey recovery. If you've noticed that there are more bald eagles around than when you were a kid or 20 years ago, that's because there are. And that's because of we don't use DDT anymore. Waterfowl, in part because of that. Waterfowl and wetland birds saw tremendous declines earlier in the 20th century, but through sustained and effective effort over decades, we're seeing that these birds are now recovering, and that these birds that were on the brink of extinction earlier in the 20th century are now some of the best conservation success stories in North America. So it gives me a lot of hope that while the threats facing grasslands and grassland birds and other birds that rely on the ag landscape, that there are a lot of threats and there's a lot of complex problems, but we understand these things really well. And if we set our minds to this, we can save grassland birds, and so that my daughter can enjoy these birds when she's older, and we can keep these birds from disappearing from Canada. I want to thank the Canadian Grassland Coalition for the opportunity to share our work today, and Canadian Wildlife Federation and Catherine and John for the tremendous work that they're doing, bringing us all together to raise awareness of grasslands. And I appreciate the opportunity to share about some of the wonderful bird life that rely on the grasslands of Canada. And I really encourage everybody to check out the Canadian Grassland Coalition website. There are some really great things on there. You can explore and learn more about the grasslands and the birds and the wildlife that depend on Canadian grasslands. There's also a Get Involved page that has really great tangible things that you can do for grasslands, including finding where a grassland is near you and going to visit it and sharing what you find there. I mean, getting out in these landscapes is one of the best things that you can do to appreciate how truly special they are. And then, of course, sharing about what you learned and letting your family and your friends and our elected leaders know how important these places are. Awareness of these places is a big part of the puzzle here, because I think to know them is to love them. So thank you for your time today, and thank you to Catherine and John and CWF and all the members of the coalition for all the work that they do as part of the coalition and for grassland conservation. And I'll end by thanking all of our donors and our partners in the work that we do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. That was really great. And thank you for doing that presentation for us today. We have quite a few questions here, so we'll get through them as quick as we can. I'll just mention that I saw your email was at the end of your slide there, so we'll add my email, John's email, and your email into the chat as well, so that people can reach out to us if they would like to. I'll start and sort of go in order. So we're starting from closer to the beginning of your presentation. The first question is, can you speak to what the producer payment structure looks like and how you came up with that structure?
Yeah, for sure. So we did a tiered structure. We're starting at around 40 cents an acre in the pilot. And then so it kind of was structured if you were scoring above 0.5 to 0.59, you're receiving about 40 cents an acre. And then from 0.6 to 0.8, you're getting about 50 cents an acre. And then in the top tier, 0.8 to 1, it was 67 cents an acre. And, you know, that payment structure, it's a pilot. And well, so we're dealing with some limitations on the amount of funding that we had to work with, and taking a bit of a first stab at valuing this. But some of it is based a little bit on what it would cost to graze, grazing costs essentially, and looking at how we could, there's sort of a rule in agricultural production that if you can improve your revenue or decrease your expenses by 5% through multiple different ways on your farm or your ranch, it ultimately adds up to a lot more profitability in the end. So looking at calculating what it costs for producers to graze either on a community pasture or the cost of land ownership, and trying to emulate some of that cost. So we've done quite a bit of work at looking at how to properly value this, and have learned a lot from the pilot including asking producers that are part of the pilot, is this a meaningful amount to affect your economic viability over the long term? And then we're looking to adjust that from based on the results of the pilot, because we're finding that probably, as expected, we were a little bit low on the amount of compensation that we're providing. So, yeah, hopefully that answers the question. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And a related question, curious if the payment program would be based on sustained annual scores greater than 0.5. Did a bird species need to simply be detected once or have repeated detections or breed on site in a given survey year to contribute to the BFI?
So there's designed, and the way that we have this have this designed is that it's an annual payment. So we would be measuring bird friendliness index at some sort of set revisit rate, depending on where you're scoring on the bird friendliness index. As you increase and get closer to 1, or confidence level that you're providing sustained benefits that are over and above the business as usual, are more likely. So then our revisit rate to go out and do bird surveys is less often. Whereas if you're more hovering around that 0.5, then we would go there more often to make sure that those benefits are being sustained. So and then to answer the question about whether birds just need to be detected once, or so it's based on densities of birds. So when we're going out, we're doing our point counts and doing the surveys on the farms and ranches, we're doing them in a way that allows us to calculate how many Sprague's pipits, how many Western meadowlarks we found per hectare, and then comparing those densities on the farms and ranches to the densities in the surrounding landscape. So that it's based on how many birds per hectare, or the densities of birds compared to the surrounding landscape.
Great. Okay, thanks. And then we had another question relating to that as well. We're talking about surrounding landscape. What if the surrounding region is above average relative to other regions, and then the index that we find is not ranked as accurately as it could be? Could it be ranked or indexed within the entire prairie ecozone?
So we put quite a bit of thought into that. So what we do is that when I'm talking about the surrounding landscape, what we use is a combination of ecoregion and province. So for example, in the pilot that we ran, most of the producers are in the mixed grass ecoregion of Saskatchewan, whereas we're also doing bird friendliness index surveys in the aspen parkland of Manitoba. So then what you get then is comparing producers that are in similar conditions. Sorry, you get a bird friendliness index that's meaningful because you're comparing it to their regional context. So it's contextualized depending on the conditions in their area. So your bird communities that you're going to find in the aspen parkland in Manitoba, where I am, versus southwestern Saskatchewan and the mixed grass ecoregion of Saskatchewan, are very different. So it wouldn't be fair to compare a farm here in Manitoba that has very few chestnut color longspurs to the mixed grass ecoregion, where it's kind of where you find a lot of those chestnut color longspurs. So we try to, doing that regionally contextualizes it. So no matter where a farm is, we get a clear indication of that they're providing benefits to bird conservation in their regional context.
Okay, great. The next question is, do you think that the BFI could be used for bats, as bats use grasslands and wetlands as their feeding ground, while the forest is where they live?
That's a very good question. I think that this type of approach of looking at, what the value of a site compared to sort of the business as usual could have, some fairly broad applications. I am going to admit that I know virtually nothing about bats, so I can't answer that question very well. what I can say is that you need to be able to reliably characterize the bird community or whatever community that you're looking for. And so that's, being able to generate those densities by some sort of survey methodology is going to be critical there. So long and short, that's a long answer, long-winded way of saying I don't know, but I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. I'm just watching the time here, so I'll ask maybe a couple more and then we'll wrap up. Where is the money coming from for the payments to landowners?
For within the pilot, it's the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation out of the U.S. is our funder there.
Okay, perfect. Do you think there will be any federal grassland policy to eliminate loss and encourage grassland restoration to strike more land use balance?
Yes, I certainly hope so, and that's something that I know that we've worked together with Canadian Wildlife Federation and a number of the different organizations that are part of the coalition. If you visit birdscanada.org/grasslands, there's a policy paper there that we work together with a number of organizations on because federal provincial policy plays a huge role in grassland conservation, and I think that that's something that again we're working towards, and we hope that this bird friendliness index work can have a role in communicating just how important grasslands are to some of the most imperiled bird and wildlife species that we have, and communicate how important these places are and spur some policy changes. And policy just plays an important role in providing those guide rails or guardrails on encouraging an agricultural system that looks at balancing all these different needs, including bird and biodiversity conservation, and reprioritizing some of what we want out of our agricultural system. So I'm very hopeful that there is, and there's our organization, along with other organizations, are working hard at getting that message across.
Okay, awesome. There's a few outstanding questions. I'm just going to ask one more. Now that the pilot is finished, what are the next steps that you will take to scale up?
Yes, so stay tuned for some incoming announcements of scaling this up. I can't say too much more about it quite yet, just because the announcement hasn't gone out. But I would encourage you to stay tuned with the various Birds Canada social media to hear more about that. A broader application of that on the Canadian prairies, and we're having a lot of good conversations with various stakeholders, and I think getting a good message across that could be something that works well, and that birds and biodiversity are an important part of the landscape that lots of agricultural food stakeholders they're hearing that message and hearing the message that we have maybe a solution to help do this. So I'm hopeful that I'll have more to share maybe if we do another webinar series. But do keep an eye on the Birds Canada socials, because there will have an announcement in the next couple of months about something exciting. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was awesome. As awesome as birds are, I have to say. We had a ton of questions, and we're really sorry we can't get to them, but Ian did put his email address at the end of his presentation, so I assume that means that you're okay if people reach out to you with their questions. So if we weren't able to get to your question today, we apologize. Just want to be respectful for everybody's time and keep the whole webinar start to finish within an hour. So please reach out to Ian, or I put mine and Catherine's email addresses in the chat as well. And if you can scroll up to find those, we're happy to pass those on to Ian. So thanks again, Ian. That was incredible. I want to line up the next webinar that'll happen next week on the 15th of April, Wednesday, co-hosted by Mindy Hockley Anderson of the Saskatchewan Stock Growers, Mitchell Zarati of the Canadian Cattle Association, and Adrian Tassad of the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program and Living Labs Program. Oh, and Krista Connick Todd, also with SODCAP, the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program. And they'll be convening a panel of producers to talk about working landscapes, ranching, and grassland stewardship. I hope you can attend that. And if you look at the emails that you got about this web series, you will find the link to register for that webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I encourage you to go to our website, www.canadasgrasslands.ca, to learn more, and I hope to see you next week.